March 7th, 1943. In a sterile conference room deep within the Reich Ministry of Armaments on Berlin's Pariser Platz, Albert Speer spread a series of photographs across the polished oak table. Each image showed the same thing from different angles. Enormous factory buildings stretching toward the horizon, assembly lines filled with tanks, parking lots packed with thousands of worker vehicles. The photographs had been taken by German intelligence agents working inside American factories. They were about to shatter Adolf Hitler's understanding of the war he was fighting. Speer's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the evidence. Not from fear, though he had reason to be afraid. What frightened him was the mathematics. Cold, undeniable numbers that revealed a truth so catastrophic it seemed almost impossible to process. The United States was building tanks at a rate that made Germany's entire industrial capacity look like a backyard workshop. If you're enjoying this, deep dive into the story. Hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The meeting had been called to discuss tank production, but it would become something far more significant. It would be the moment when the architects of the Third Reich began to understand that they had already lost the war. Not on the battlefield, not through any failure of courage or tactical brilliance, but in the factories, in the foundries and assembly plants. In the fundamental equation of industrial warfare that they had catastrophically misjudged. Hitler arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, flanked by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl. He was in a foul mood. The disaster at Stalingrad was barely a month old, the surrender of the Sixth Army having cost Germany 300,000 men. Now Speer was demanding his time for yet another briefing about production figures. Hitler had little patience for such matters. He believed in willpower, in the fighting spirit of the German soldier, in the superiority of German equipment. Numbers on paper meant nothing compared to the reality of combat. Speer began carefully. He knew Hitler's temper, knew how the Führer reacted to information that contradicted his worldview. So he started with German production figures, establishing a baseline. In 1942, German factories had produced 4,098 tanks of all types. It was a respectable number, achieved through enormous effort. Every factory was working at capacity. Every available resource had been mobilized. Workers labored 12, 14 hours a day. The entire nation was straining to feed the war machine. Hitler nodded approvingly. 4,000 tanks. It seemed substantial. Impressive, even. Enough to replace losses on the Eastern Front and maintain reserves for the inevitable Allied invasion in the West. Then Speer placed the first American photograph on the table. The image showed the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit, Michigan. A single building, 800 meters long, 400 meters wide. Under one roof, an area larger than many German towns. The photograph had been taken from an elevated position, perhaps from a water tower or tall building nearby, and it captured the full scale of the facility. Row after row of M4 Sherman tanks, 47 of them visible in various stages of assembly, marching down parallel production lines like soldiers on parade. Hitler picked up the photograph, studied it for a long moment. Speer watched the Führer's face, saw the initial skepticism, the furrowing of the brow. "This is one factory," Speer said quietly. "The Chrysler plant produces approximately 1,000 tanks per month." The room fell silent. 1,000 tanks per month meant 12,000 per year. From a single factory. 3 times Germany's entire annual production. Hitler set the photograph down carefully, as if it might be contaminated. "Propaganda," he said. The word hung in the air. "The Americans are masters of deception. They want us to believe they have capabilities they don't possess." But Speer had anticipated this reaction. He had brought not one photograph, but dozens. Not one source of intelligence, but multiple independent confirmations. He spread them across the table like a card dealer revealing a winning hand, though in this case it was Germany that had lost. Another photograph, the Ford Willow Run plant near Ypsilanti, Michigan. This one was even more staggering. A building 1,600 meters long, the length of 16 city blocks, assembled under a single roof. The caption, verified by 3 separate intelligence sources, indicated this plant produced B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 aircraft every 63 minutes. Keitel, who prided himself on his loyalty to the Führer, nevertheless couldn't suppress a gasp. 1 4-engine bomber per hour. The entire German aircraft industry struggled to produce 15,000 planes in a year. This single American facility was capable of producing 8,000 bombers annually. Hitler's jaw tightened. How do we know these photographs are authentic? They could build false factories, photograph them, spread the images to demoralize us. Speer had expected this too. He opened a leather folder and extracted a document marked Top Secret, Eyes Only. It was a report compiled by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's Abwehr, German military intelligence. Over the past 6 months, German agents had infiltrated 12 major American factories, not saboteurs, but observers. Engineers and technicians who had immigrated to America before the war, who still maintained their loyalty to the Reich, who had managed to secure employment in war production facilities. Their reports told the same story from different locations: massive plants, revolutionary production methods, assembly lines that moved constantly, workers standing at fixed stations while the tanks or aircraft or ships moved past them. Standardization of parts that allowed for incredible speed. A Sherman tank, according to one agent's detailed observation, required approximately 500 man-hours of labor to complete. A German Panzer IV required 3,000 man-hours. The mathematics were brutal. Even if German workers were somehow more skilled, more dedicated, they couldn't overcome a 6-to-1 disadvantage in efficiency. Hitler read the report in silence. Speer could see the man's mind working, searching for escape routes from the trap these numbers represented. The Führer had built his entire ideology on assumptions about racial superiority, about the weakness of democratic societies, about the inherent inferiority of mixed-race populations. America, in Hitler's worldview, was a mongrel nation. Jews and Negroes and immigrants from every corner of the world, all thrown together in a chaotic mess that should have been inherently weak. Could such a nation possibly outproduce the pure Aryan state? But the numbers didn't care about ideology. The numbers were ruthless in their clarity. Speer continued his presentation, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. The United States had 16 major tank production facilities operating at full capacity. Their combined monthly output was approximately 3,200 tanks. By the end of 1943, American industry planned to produce 29,000 tanks, 7 times German production. And this was only tanks. Speer showed additional figures. Aircraft production. The Americans were on track to manufacture 85,000 military aircraft in 1943 alone. Germany, straining every factory to its absolute limit, had produced 25,000 aircraft in 1942 and couldn't significantly increase that number without cannibalizing other vital industries. Steel production. The United States produced 81 million tons of steel in 1942. Germany produced 20 million tons, a 4-to-1 disadvantage in the fundamental raw material of modern warfare: shipping. The Americans had developed a new class of cargo vessel called the Liberty ship. Using prefabrication techniques, American shipyards could assemble one of these ships in approximately 45 days. Some yards had done it faster. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been constructed in just 7 days from keel laying to launch. German shipyards required 6 months to build a comparable vessel. The Liberty ship program alone represented a fundamental transformation in industrial capability. By the end of 1942, American yards had launched over 700 Liberty ships. By war's end, the Americans would build 2,700 of them. This meant the United States could replace shipping losses faster than German U-boats could sink Allied vessels. The entire submarine campaign, which Hitler had counted on to strangle Britain, was being rendered obsolete by American industrial capacity. Hitler stood abruptly, pushing back from the table. "Enough," he said. His voice was sharp, angry. I don't want to hear any more about American fairy tales. These numbers are exaggerated. They must be. No nation can produce at such levels. It violates everything we understand about industrial capacity. Speer pressed on, knowing he might not get another chance to make Hitler understand. My Führer, these figures have been verified by multiple independent sources. Our agents in America, aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, testimony from prisoners of war who worked in American factories. Every source confirms the same basic reality. American industrial production is real, it is vast, and it is growing. Hitler demanded, "Haven't we seen this production overwhelming our forces? If the Americans have such capacity, where are these tens of thousands? Of tanks?" It was a fair question, and Speer had an answer. Time and distance. My Führer, American factories are producing the weapons, but getting them across the Atlantic, training troops to use them, building the logistical infrastructure to sustain them in combat, all of that takes time. But that time is running out. In North Africa, our forces are already encountering American equipment in quantities that exceed our intelligence estimates. When the Allies invade Europe, and they will invade, they will bring this industrial capacity with them. The meeting dissolved into argument. Keitel supported Hitler's skepticism, suggesting the intelligence was flawed or deliberately planted. Jodl was more cautious, acknowledging that even if the numbers were somewhat exaggerated, the general trend was alarming. Speer stood his ground, insisting that ignoring this reality would not make it disappear. Finally, Hitler issued his ultimatum. He didn't want to hear any more about American production figures. Germany would focus on its own capabilities, its own production, its own strengths. The meeting was over. But as the participants filed out of the conference room, Speer lingered for a moment, gathering his documents. He knew what Hitler refused to accept. The war had already been decided, not by courage or strategy or tactical brilliance, but by cold industrial mathematics. Germany was fighting an opponent whose productive capacity exceeded its own by factors of 3, 4, 5 to 1, depending on the category. And that opponent, the United States, was simultaneously fighting Japan in the Pacific, supplying the Soviet Union with equipment, and supporting British forces. America was fighting a multi-front war and still outproducing Germany in every category that mattered. The roots of this disaster stretched back years before the war began, to the fundamental assumptions that had guided Nazi planning. Hitler's worldview was built on racial theories that blinded him to economic realities. He believed that a racially pure, authoritarian state would naturally outperform a diverse, democratic society. He dismissed American industrial capacity as propaganda because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that his entire ideology was flawed. German military planners had compounded this error by preparing for short, decisive wars. Blitzkrieg doctrine emphasized speed and shock, achieving victory before an enemy could fully mobilize. It had worked brilliantly in Poland and France, where German forces had defeated opponents before they could bring their full strength to bear. But Blitzkrieg assumed wars would be short. It assumed opponents would collapse before they could leverage their industrial base. The Soviet Union had refused to collapse. Despite catastrophic losses in 1941 and 42, the Red Army kept fighting, kept recruiting new divisions, kept fielding tanks and aircraft. And behind the Soviets stood American industry, shipping thousands of trucks, tanks, and aircraft to the Eastern Front through Lend-Lease. Even as German forces fought the Red Army, they were indirectly fighting American factories. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States in December 1941 had sealed Germany's fate, though it would take years for the full consequences to become apparent. At that moment, Hitler believed he understood American power. He saw a nation that was geographically distant, militarily unprepared, socially divided. He calculated that America would be too slow to mobilize, too distracted by Japan in the Pacific, too soft from years of peace and prosperity. Every assumption had been catastrophically wrong. American industry had spent the Depression building enormous factories and developing mass production techniques. The automobile industry alone represented an industrial base larger than Germany's entire manufacturing sector. When war came, these factories didn't need to be built, they just needed to be converted. Car plants became tank factories. Aircraft manufacturers expanded to massive scale. Shipyards that had been idle during peacetime roared back to life. The American government had mobilized this capacity with remarkable speed. The War Production Board, created in January 1942, coordinated production across thousands of factories. It allocated raw materials, prioritized critical items, resolved bottlenecks. Within months, American industrial output began to climb at rates that seemed impossible to German observers. By mid-1943, when Speer presented his evidence to Hitler, the gap was already unbridgeable. But the human mind resists uncomfortable truths, especially when accepting them means abandoning deeply held beliefs. Hitler couldn't acknowledge American industrial superiority without questioning his entire worldview. So he dismissed the evidence, attacked the methodology, blamed Jewish conspirators for spreading lies. This psychological blindness extended beyond Hitler. Many German military leaders, trained in a tradition that emphasized quality over quantity, tactical skill over industrial capacity, struggled to grasp what they were facing. They understood individual battles, tactical victories and defeats. What they couldn't fully comprehend was that the war had become a contest of production, and Germany was losing that contest before the battles were even fought. In the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, Cleveland and Toledo, American workers assembled tanks and aircraft at rates that would have seemed like fantasy to their German counterparts. These workers were not slaves or conscripts. They were paid wages that made them middle class, drove their own cars to work, lived in houses with electricity and running water. Many were women, taking jobs that had previously been reserved for men. Many were minorities, African Americans and Hispanic Americans, working alongside whites in a shared cause. The diversity that Hitler had identified as American weakness turned out to be a source of strength. Different perspectives, different approaches to problem solving, different traditions of craftsmanship and innovation all combined to create an industrial system more flexible and productive than Germany's rigid hierarchy. American factories operated on principles that violated German assumptions about production. Instead of master craftsmen assembling products from start to finish, American workers specialized in single tasks, becoming extraordinarily efficient at their specific role. Instead of custom building each item, American factories standardized components, making parts interchangeable. A turret built in Detroit fit perfectly onto a hull made in Ohio. This standardization enabled distributed production, with multiple factories building components that could be assembled anywhere. The results spoke for themselves. By the end of 1943, the United States had produced 37,188 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany, despite maximum effort, despite mobilizing every available resource, produced only 5,747 tanks that year. The ratio was nearly 7-1, and 1944 would be worse. As American production continued to accelerate, German output began to falter. Allied bombing campaigns targeted German factories, forcing production to disperse to smaller, less efficient facilities. Raw material shortages, especially critical alloys needed for tank armor and aircraft engines, began to constrain German production. Transportation networks, pounded by Allied aircraft, struggled to move components between factories. By early 1944, the question was no longer whether Germany could win the war, but how long Germany could continue to fight before being crushed by sheer weight of Allied material. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first concrete evidence of American productive capacity reached German frontline commanders not through intelligence reports, but through direct combat experience in North Africa. When American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, German officers prepared to face the soft, inexperienced troops that Nazi propaganda had promised them. Initial encounters seemed to confirm these expectations. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel smashed through American lines. Inexperienced American troops, facing veteran German units for the first time, broke and retreated. German radio broadcasts trumpeted the victory as proof of American weakness. But German officers on the ground noticed something that troubled them deeply. The Americans retreated, yes, but they retreated in vehicles, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, all in remarkably good condition, all well supplied with fuel. When the Americans regrouped, they didn't come back weaker, they came back with more equipment, more ammunition, more everything. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer reconnaissance unit, captured an American supply depot during the Kasserine offensive. What he found there stunned him. Mountains of supplies. Crates of ammunition stacked higher than a man could reach. Barrels of fuel, hundreds of them. Spare parts for vehicles in quantities that seemed absurd. Food, medicine, equipment all in abundance that suggested an industrial capacity far beyond German intelligence estimates. Von Luck was a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. He had seen German supply operations at their best. Never had he witnessed anything approaching the logistical abundance of this single American depot. And this, he realized, was supporting just one American division in a secondary theater of the war. If a single division in North Africa received such support, what would a full-scale American army in Europe look like? He reported his findings to headquarters. His report joined others flowing back from North Africa, from U-boat commanders in the Atlantic who were encountering ever larger convoys, from Luftwaffe pilots who faced increasing numbers of American aircraft. The pattern was undeniable. American production wasn't propaganda, it was real. In Berlin, some officials began quietly preparing for Germany's defeat. Not openly, such thoughts were treason. But in private meetings, in carefully worded memos, in contingency plans that would never be formally acknowledged, certain individuals recognized that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Speer himself, despite his loyalty to Hitler, began focusing less on producing enough weapons to win and more on producing enough to delay defeat. If Germany couldn't match Allied production, perhaps it could develop weapons qualitatively superior enough to partially offset the numerical disadvantage. This thinking led to increased investment in advanced tank designs like the Tiger and Panther, which were indeed superior to most Allied tanks in direct combat. But this strategy had its own problems. The Tiger tank was a marvel of engineering. It mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its armor was thick enough to withstand most Allied anti-tank weapons. In single combat, a Tiger was nearly unstoppable. However, the Tiger required approximately 300,000 man-hours to build, compared to 60,000 for a Sherman. The Tiger needed specially trained crews and constant maintenance. Its complex transmission broke down frequently. Its fuel consumption was enormous, 700 litres, per 100 kilometres on roads, much more cross-country. And most critically, Germany could only produce about 1,300 Tigers during the entire war. Against this, the Americans built more than 49,000 Shermans. Even if each Tiger could destroy 10 Shermans before being disabled, an optimistic ratio, the Americans would still have overwhelming numerical superiority. The cold mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side that could replace losses faster, and America could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. This became painfully clear in the skies over Germany itself. Starting in 1943, American B-17 flying fortresses began appearing over German cities in formations that grew larger with each passing month. At first, dozens of bombers, then hundreds. By 1944, formations of over 1,000 aircraft struck German industrial centers with terrifying regularity. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies earlier in the war, found itself increasingly outnumbered. German fighter pilots, among the best trained in the world, shot down American bombers by the dozens, but the Americans kept coming. For every bomber destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every German fighter lost, the Americans fielded 5 more. The war had become a contest of production, and production was determined by industrial capacity. Germany had entered a fight it couldn't win through courage, skill, or tactical brilliance. Those qualities mattered in individual engagements, but over time, over hundreds of battles and thousands of sorties, numerical superiority ground down qualitative advantages. By the spring of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, the outcome was mathematically certain. The only questions that remained were how long Germany would continue fighting and how many more people would die before the inevitable end. June 6, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. Lieutenant General Dietrich Kress, commander of the German 352nd Infantry Division, stood at his observation post near Vierville-sur-Mer and watched what appeared to be the ocean itself rising up to swallow his defences. Through his Zeiss field binoculars, he saw a sight that made rational military assessment almost impossible. 5,000 ships stretched across the horizon from the Cotentin Peninsula toward the River Orne. Not hundreds, thousands. Landing craft, destroyers, battleships, cargo vessels, tankers, all moving in coordinated formations toward the Normandy coast. Above them, the sky was black with aircraft, bombers, fighters, transport planes carrying paratroopers, all protected by swarms of escort fighters. Kress had fought in Russia. He had seen the massive offensives the Red Army could mount. But this was different. This was industrial warfare, distilled to its purest, most overwhelming form. The Americans and British weren't just bringing an army across. The English Channel, they were bringing their entire industrial economy, packaged and shipped, ready to reassemble on French soil. By noon on that first day, over 130,000 Allied troops had come ashore, supported by 20,000 vehicles, and this was just the beginning. Each hour brought more ships, more men, more equipment. The beaches that Hitler's Atlantic Wall was supposed to defend had become highways for an invasion force whose scale defied comprehension. Major Helmut Meyer, commanding a battalion of the 21st Panzer Division, spent the morning of June 6th counting enemy vehicles. By his tally, over 600 American tanks landed on Omaha and Utah beaches in just 6 hours. 600 tanks. That was more armoured strength than the entire Panzer Group West had available to defend the French coast. And when the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, one of Germany's elite armoured units, counterattacked near Caen with 80 Panthers and Tigers, they met something unprecedented. For every German tank, there were 4 or 5 Allied tanks. The Germans fought with skill and determination, their superior tanks winning individual engagements. But the Allies simply had more, always more. Meyer watched as his division destroyed 67 Canadian tanks in a single engagement. By dawn the next day, every Canadian loss had been replaced with fresh tanks rolling off the landing ships. The German losses? Permanent. No replacements were coming. The factories that might have built them were being bombed into rubble. The trains that might have carried them were being strafed by Allied fighters. The fuel that might have powered them was locked away in distant refineries, cut off by Allied control of the seas. The logistical miracle unfolding on the Normandy beaches shocked even veteran German officers who thought they'd seen everything. Within 2 weeks of the initial landing, the Allies constructed 2 artificial harbours, complete, functional ports capable of unloading 7,000 tons of supplies per day. They had transported entire harbours across the English Channel. Concrete caissons, floating roadways, breakwaters, all towed across open water and assembled on hostile shores under German fire. Colonel Anton Stauffenberg, watching this construction from his command post, could only marvel at the engineering. This was capability Germany simply didn't possess. The ability to project power across water, to build infrastructure faster than the enemy could destroy it, to sustain massive armies far from their home bases, these were the fruits of industrial capacity that Hitler had dismissed as propaganda. By June 30th, over 850,000 men, 148,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies had landed on the Normandy shores. In less than a month, the Allies had brought an entire army group across the Channel and established a lodgment that was growing stronger by the hour. The Germans threw everything they had at this beachhead: counterattacks by panzer divisions, artillery bombardments, desperate infantry assaults. Nothing stopped the build-up. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, sent increasingly desperate cables to Berlin. The Americans had unlimited reserves, he reported. Each day brought new divisions. Where Germany was scraping together what forces it could, pulling units from other fronts, the Americans seemed to have an infinite supply of fresh troops and new equipment. The truth was even more staggering than German intelligence suspected. The forces landing in Normandy represented only a fraction of American military capacity. Simultaneously, American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, engaging Japanese forces in campaigns that stretched from New Guinea to the Marianas. American factories were producing enough equipment to supply not just their own forces, but British, French, and Soviet armies as well. Hitler, in his headquarters in East Prussia, received reports from Normandy with a mixture of rage and denial. He ordered counterattacks, demanded that his generals throw the Allies back into the sea, insisted that German willpower would overcome Allied material superiority, but the orders couldn't change the mathematics. The industrial equation that Speer had tried to show him in 1943 was now being demonstrated in blood and steel on the beaches of France. In the forests and hedgerows of Normandy, German soldiers discovered what industrial supremacy meant in practice. American artillery fired shells with abandon, 10 rounds for every German round fired back. American aircraft appeared overhead whenever the weather permitted, turning any movement in daylight into a death sentence. American tanks, while individually inferior to German Panthers and Tigers, attacked in groups of 5 or 6, coordinated by radio, supported by infantry, artillery. The German defenders fought with skill born of years of combat experience. They made the Allies pay for every kilometre of ground. But they were fighting a losing battle of attrition, and attrition favoured the side with more resources. For every German soldier killed or wounded, there was no replacement. For every German tank destroyed, no new one could be sent. Meanwhile, Allied losses, though heavy, were replaced within days by the endless stream of men and equipment flowing across the Channel. By late July, the Allied build-up in Normandy reached a critical mass. Over 1 million soldiers occupied a lodgment 50 miles deep and 100 miles wide. 16 tank divisions, 30 infantry divisions, all fully equipped, all receiving regular supplies, all backed by overwhelming air power. Against this force, Germany could field perhaps 400,000 men, exhausted from weeks of constant combat, short on ammunition, low on fuel, with no hope of meaningful reinforcement. The breakout came at the end of July. Operation Cobra smashed through German defences west of Saint-Lô, opening a gap that American armour exploited with devastating speed. Within days, General George Patton's Third Army was racing across Brittany, then turning east toward Paris. The carefully prepared German defences in Normandy, which had cost so much American blood to penetrate, suddenly collapsed as Allied mobile forces bypassed strongpoints and drove deep into France. German commanders, seeing their defensive lines crumbling, pleaded for permission to retreat, to save what remained of their forces. Hitler refused. He ordered another counterattack, this one at Mortagne, aimed at cutting through to the sea and splitting the American forces. It was a fantasy born of desperation. The attack went in on August 7th with what remained of 4 panzer divisions. It gained a few kilometres before being smashed by Allied air power and artillery. The Germans lost another 100 tanks they couldn't replace. By mid-August, the German army in Normandy was trapped. The Falaise Pocket, as it came to be called, became a killing ground, where what remained of 7 German armies was systematically destroyed. Allied aircraft hunted German columns like wolves among sheep. Artillery fire shredded any attempt at organised withdrawal. When the pocket finally closed, 50,000 German soldiers were dead, another 200,000 captured. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, All the equipment of 7 armies lay smashed and burning in Norman fields. Paris fell on August 25th. The city that Hitler had vowed to defend to the last building was liberated with barely a shot fired. German forces, what remained of them, were fleeing east toward the German border, hoping to re-establish defensive lines on the Rhine. In Berlin, reality was becoming impossible to deny. The reports from France detailed a catastrophe of stunning proportions. Not just a tactical defeat, but the complete destruction of Germany's position in the West. And behind this disaster lay the same industrial capacity that Speer had tried to warn Hitler about 18 months earlier. In September 1944, Speer prepared another report for Hitler. This one didn't focus on American production figures. Those were now undeniable, demonstrated by the forces rampaging across France. Instead, Speer laid out Germany's current military situation in stark terms. On all fronts, Germany was outnumbered and outgunned. In the east, Soviet armies, equipped with thousands of American trucks and tanks delivered through Lend-Lease, were approaching the borders of the Reich itself. In the west, Allied forces were preparing to invade Germany. Germany's total operational tank strength across all fronts had fallen to approximately 1,200 vehicles. The Americans alone had over 5,000 tanks in Western Europe, with more arriving daily. The disparity in aircraft was even worse. The Luftwaffe could barely field 800 fighters on any given day. American and British air forces had over 10,000 operational aircraft in Europe. The industrial base that might have closed this gap was crumbling. Allied bombing had devastated German oil production, leaving tanks and aircraft without fuel. Transportation networks were so badly damaged that moving equipment between factories had become nearly impossible. Even if German industry could somehow match Allied production rates, and it couldn't, there was no way to get equipment to the front. Hitler read Speer's report in silence. Then he spoke, and what he said revealed how completely the war had transformed his understanding. "They have," he said slowly, "built a war machine that operates on principles I never imagined, not through superior tactics or strategy, but through sheer abundance. They don't need to outthink us, they can simply outlast us, bury us under mountains of steel and explosives, grind us down through attrition we cannot match." It was an admission that came far too late to change anything. The industrial reality Speer had tried to show him in 1943, the reality he had dismissed as propaganda, was now crushing Germany from both east and west. The war he had started with such confidence, certain that German racial superiority would prevail, had become a demonstration of industrial capacity's primacy over ideology. In the final months of 1944, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from multiple directions, Hitler's staff compiled final statistics on war production. The numbers told a story of complete industrial defeat. The United States had produced approximately 88,500 tanks during the war. Germany had produced roughly 49,000. Nearly a 2-to-1 American advantage, and this didn't account for British or Soviet production. But tanks were just one metric among many. American factories had produced almost 300,000 military aircraft. Germany had built slightly over 100,000. American shipyards had launched 2,700 Liberty ships alone, not counting warships, landing craft, or other vessels. The disparity wasn't just in quantity, but in the ability to sustain production while improving quality, to field new designs while maintaining old ones, to supply forces on multiple continents simultaneously. The ideological blindness that had led Hitler to underestimate American power extended beyond simple miscalculation. It represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how industrial warfare worked in the 20th century. Hitler had built his entire worldview on assumptions about racial superiority, about the weakness of diverse democracies, about the corrupting influence of Jewish participation in society. Every assumption, when tested against the reality of total war, had failed. American power wasn't built on racial purity, it was built on diversity. A workforce that drew from multiple ethnic traditions, that included women and minorities in industrial production, that combined different perspectives and approaches to problem solving. This diversity, which Hitler identified as weakness, proved to be a source of tremendous strength and flexibility. American power wasn't built on authoritarian discipline, it was built on decentralized innovation. Thousands of engineers and factory managers solving problems without waiting for orders from above, a system that rewarded efficiency and innovation rather than ideological purity. Workers who were motivated by wages and belief in their cause rather than fear of punishment. American power wasn't built on lies and propaganda. It was built on actual factories running 3 shifts a day, actual workers assembling tanks and aircraft, actual ships crossing oceans with actual supplies. The democratic system Hitler had mocked proved more effective at total war than his dictatorship. The free exchange of ideas, including contributions from Jewish scientists and engineers, drove innovation faster than centralized control ever could. By early 1945, with Soviet forces fighting in the suburbs of Berlin and American forces crossing the Rhine, Hitler's understanding of these failures was complete. In conversations with his staff, recorded by stenographers, his tone had shifted from denial to bitter acceptance. He spoke about American production with something approaching awe. They had, he admitted, created something he had never imagined possible, an industrial system that could fight a 2-ocean war, supply multiple allies, and still expand production. In one conversation from January 1945, Hitler reflected on his declaration of war against America in December 1941. If he had understood American power then, he said, he would have made different choices. But even as he spoke these words, they revealed continued misunderstanding. The problem wasn't just that he declared war at the wrong time. The problem was that his entire ideology made it impossible for him to accurately assess what he was facing. Understanding American industrial capacity would have required Hitler to abandon the core beliefs that defined him. He would have had to accept that racial diversity could be a strength rather than a weakness, that democracy could mobilize resources more effectively than dictatorship, that the contributions of Jewish scientists, engineers, and workers strengthened rather than weakened a nation, that industrial capacity, not racial superiority or martial virtue, would determine the outcome of modern warfare. These weren't just tactical errors, they were philosophical impossibilities for Hitler. His worldview didn't just lead him to underestimate America, it made accurate assessment impossible. The same ideology that drove him to start the war prevented him from understanding the forces that would end it. The final weeks of the war brought a cascade of disasters. In the east, Soviet armies smashed through what remained of German defenses, racing toward Berlin in a fury of vengeance. In the west, American and British forces crossed the Rhine and drove deep into Germany, finding practically no organized resistance. German industry, already crippled by bombing and lack of raw materials, ceased functioning entirely. Soldiers at the front had no ammunition, no fuel, often no food. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet artillery shells falling on the Reich Chancellery above his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. 8 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war he had begun, with absolute confidence in German superiority, the war he had thought would establish a 1,000-year Reich, had lasted less than 6 years. American power, the power he had dismissed as propaganda, and finally understood too late, had helped crush his regime in a fraction of the time he had imagined his empire would endure. The final accounting of American industrial production during the war validated everything Speer had tried to warn Hitler about. The numbers were staggering in their implications. America had produced enough military equipment to supply 3 complete armies, its own, Britain's, and substantial portions of the Soviet Union's. They had built the ships to carry this equipment across oceans, the trucks to move it across continents, the logistics systems to sustain it in combat. They had done all this while maintaining civilian production, while raising living standards at home, while operating under democratic constraints Hitler had considered crippling weaknesses. The lesson wasn't simply about military strategy or industrial capacity. It was about the danger of ideology so rigid it blinds its adherents to obvious truths. Hitler didn't just underestimate American power, he made it philosophically impossible for himself to estimate it accurately. His racial theories, his beliefs about democracy, his assumptions about what made nations strong, all of these prevented him from seeing what was plainly visible to anyone without ideological blinders. German military professionals who had visited America before the war, industrialists who had toured American factories, intelligence officers who compiled objective data, all of them had tried to sound warnings about American capacity. All of them had been dismissed because their observations contradicted Nazi ideology. The truth was available. The evidence was there. But ideology trumped reality until reality arrived in overwhelming force on the beaches of Normandy and the plains of Eastern Europe. In the prisoner of war camps where German generals were held after the surrender, conversations inevitably turned to the question of how Germany had lost. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, considered one of Germany's finest tactical minds, put it simply: "We did not underestimate the American army. We underestimated American industry." General Heinz Guderian, father of the Blitzkrieg concept, was more philosophical in his assessment. He wrote in his diary that Germany had fought against an industrial coalition, not against armies, but against factories. The German military had prepared to fight a peacetime American force of 200,000 men. They had not accounted for American industry's ability to equip and mobilize millions of soldiers in just 2 years. The numbers told the complete story. In 4 years, American industrial production doubled in size, providing almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment, 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. Against this torrent of production, Germany's strained industrial base could manage only a fraction, approximately 100,000 aircraft, 49,000 tanks, proportionally less of everything else. The war had become what Speer predicted in that March 1943 meeting, a contest of production. And in that contest, the outcome was never in doubt once Hitler made the catastrophic decision to declare war on the United States. The only questions that remained were how long Germany would continue fighting and how many more people would die before mathematics made defeat inevitable. On May 8, 1945, German representatives signed unconditional surrender documents. The war in Europe was over. American forces occupied Germany alongside British, French, and Soviet armies. American equipment filled the arsenals of armies from Moscow to Manila. American industrial might had decided the outcome of the largest conflict in human history. Hitler's final understanding of American power had come in a bunker surrounded by ruins, with the sound of Soviet artillery echoing overhead, with no possibility of escape. He understood at last what he had been fighting: not just an army, not just a nation, but an industrial system that operated on principles his ideology could never accommodate. He understood too late, too completely, with no chance to apply that understanding. The catastrophe began with a misunderstanding and ended with comprehension that arrived only after the war was irretrievably lost. From December 11, 1941, when Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on America, until April 30, 1945, when he ended his life in a Berlin bunker, the arc of understanding traced the arc of Germany's destruction. What Hitler said when he finally grasped American power mattered less than what he couldn't say: that his entire worldview had been wrong, that the assumptions defining his life were false, that he had led Germany to annihilation, not despite his beliefs, but because of them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the 2 other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.